In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the AWS Cost and Usage Report, or CUR. The CUR is a copy of the data that Amazon uses to calculate your AWS bill. And because it's data, you can use whatever tools and processes you like to analyze and understand that data. This is really important when you're working with multiple AWS accounts or you're trying to automate your cost reporting processes. So let's take a look at how to set it up. To get started, navigate over to the Billing and Cost Management service in the AWS console and select Data Exports from the menu on the left. The CUR is accessed through the Data Exports menu because the way the CUR works is that the data is copied or exported into an S3 bucket that you own. So next, let's click on the Create button and start defining the data that we want to export. The first option we see is the export type, with the options being the standard data export, a dashboard powered by QuickSight, and the legacy CUR export. All of these export options work in the same way in that they export data to S3, and they have similar configuration options. We'll do a separate video to look at the QuickSight dashboard, but this video is going to be focused on setting up the standard export type, which is the CUR Report 2.0. The next option we see is the export name, so let's go ahead and give our export a name before moving on to the content settings, where we can define options for what is included in our export. The first option, Include Resource IDs, breaks out the cost information by each individual AWS resource. So for instance, if you had 10 Lambdas, you can see how much cost each of those Lambdas is incurring individually. This is useful if you're working in an AWS account that doesn't have a strict tagging policy, or if you're doing a deep investigation into costs and billing. Keep in mind that depending on your environment, this option could increase the size of your data export significantly. That means there would be an additional cost in just storing larger files on S3, but also any tools that you're using to process and analyze this data are going to need to be capable of handling the increased size as well. The next option, Split Cost Allocation Data, is used by the Amazon Elastic Container Service, or ECS, to separate the costs associated with the container from the costs associated with the container host. This is useful for teams that separate the ownership of the application running inside the container from the ownership of the container infrastructure, and they want to model that relationship in the way that they attribute costs. Split cost allocation data will also increase the size of your export, so that's something to be aware of if you do need to use this option. The time granularity option aggregates your data into hourly, daily, or monthly intervals. Keep in mind, the smaller the interval, the larger the export size is going to be. For this demo, I'm going to use the daily interval. Next up is the column selection. By default, all of the columns are selected, but if there's a column that you know that you are not going to use, you can uncheck it to reduce the size of your report. So that completes the options that we have to determine what is included in our report. The next thing we need to decide is what we want our report to look like. The available file formats are Parquet, which you should select if you're using something like Amazon Athena or data processing tools like Apache Spark to process this data export. For everything else, you probably want to select gzip text CSV. The file versioning option allows you to choose if you want to overwrite the file every time the data is exported, or if you want to create a new file every time the data is exported. Keep in mind, if you choose the new data export option, there's going to be costs associated with storing more data on S3. The next section is where we configure our S3 bucket. Keep in mind that this S3 bucket needs to be hosted in the same account where the export is generated. We can optionally specify a path prefix. and then click Create. So a few hours later, if we go out to the S3 bucket that we created, we should see that the data has been exported. Here I'm navigating down to the specific file I'm looking for, and I'm going to download it. Here's the file in Excel. Note that I'm using a test account with hardly any services running in it, and the file is already quite large, over 500K. So depending on what you have in your AWS account, your file could be much larger. For comparison, I pulled a similar CUR report from an account that has a moderate amount of services running, and the file size was 185 megabytes. So it's important to understand the data that you need and the capabilities of the tools you'll be using to analyze this data. And finally, the CUR 2.0 format includes embedded JSON in one of the columns, so that might affect which tools you use to analyze this data. So that completes our look at the cost and usage report. For anyone looking to automate their CUR report generation, we are sharing the code that we use in the description below, so check that out if you're interested. Otherwise, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.